Picture this, okay? The floodwaters are they are absolutely raging.
Right.
The waves are monstrous. The ancient texts describe them as being literally like mountains, right? Just these towering walls of water completely obliterating the landscape.
Right, it's total destruction.
Exactly. And right in the middle of this, you have a prophet, a man known for his immense righteousness and this lifelong, grueling dedication to his mission. He's standing on the deck of an ark, watching the old world just be swallowed alive.
It's a terrifying scene.
It really is. And out there, thrashing in the water, right in the crosshairs of this massive destructive event, is his own son.
Yeah.
He watches his child drowning. And so, operating on pure primal biological instinct, this prophet calls out to God. He asks for his son to be saved, referencing, a prior divine promise to save his family.
Which is completely understandable.
Right. But the response he gets, it doesn't just deny him. It fundamentally shatters and rewires human sociology forever. God tells him, essentially, he is not your family.
Yeah, it is one of the most abrupt, absolute paradigm shifts in recorded theological history. I mean, it completely severs the traditional, comforting understanding of what constitutes a family or a nation or a community.
And the most shocking part for anyone reading this narrative, the part that makes you just stop dead in your tracks, is what happens next. This prophet knew. He doesn't argue.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't beg further. He actually ends up actively apologizing to God. Let's really unpack this today because it feels so counterintuitive.
It really does.
Why on earth is a prophet apologizing for a basic fatherly instinct? I mean, isn't wanting to pull your drowning child out of the water the most human, decent thing you can possibly do? Why say sorry for that?
That is the absolute crux of the issue. And, well, the answer requires us to look at a concept the source material we are examining today calls the rational deen.
Okay, the rational deen.
Right, the divine system of life. We are looking at this brilliant, deeply rationalist breakdown of the conclusion of the Prophet Nuh narrative.
Specifically focusing on Surah Hud, right? Ayat 47 through 49.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the intellectual bombshell the author drops here is that in this divine system, there are absolutely no get-out-of-jail-free cards.
Wow. None at all.
None. The law of requital, which is the strict, unyielding mechanism of cause and effect in human morality, it does not do favors. It doesn't care about nepotism.
Right.
It doesn't even bend for a messenger's bloodline. Biological DNA means absolutely nothing if the ideological and moral DNA of the individual is corrupt.
Which is such a heavy concept for you to chew on as we begin today. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, drawing entirely from this translated lecture on these three highly specific, incredibly dense verses, is to understand how the mechanics of history, society, and universal justice operate without a shred of bias.
That's a huge topic.
It is. We're going to explore how a society either plunges itself into a man-made hell of its own design, or how it successfully lands in a state of absolute, productive, unshakable peace.
And to understand that macro-level societal piece, we really have to start with that deeply emotional, chaotic, micro-level scene on the water.
Yeah.
The tension there is what sets up the entire philosophy.
So let's immerse ourselves in that scene properly. The Ark is tossing on these massive waves. Nuh is on board, surrounded by a very small group of followers. And the text notes that this isn't just a sudden, freak physical weather event.
Right, it's not just a hurricane.
Exactly. It's the combination of a massive, drawn-out societal clash. The pressure has been building for generations. Nuh looks out, and he sees his son. His son is not among the believers.
No, he's actively opposed them.
Right. His son has aligned himself with the elite, arrogant class that actively mocked Nuh and perpetuated the societal injustice that brought this flood about in the first place. But in that moment, seeing the boy go under, Nuh isn't looking at a political opponent.
He's looking at his kid.
He's looking at his kid. He calls out, reminding God of a promise. He says, in effect, "You promised to save my family, my all, and my son is drowning. Your promise is true. You are the most just of judges."
And from a purely human perspective, it is a completely logical, airtight plea. I mean, he's looking at the parameters as he understands them.
Yeah, he's thinking, you said my family would be saved.
Exactly. This boy shares my blood, he shares my genetics, he grew up in my household. Therefore, by every definition I know, he's family. Please, save him.
Makes total sense.
But God's response fundamentally redefines the parameters of human relationships. The divine pushback is swift and it is absolute. The quote is, "He is not of your family, his conduct is unrighteous."
That line gives me chills every time I hear it. He is not of your family. It's so deliberate. It's not saying, yes, he is your family, but I have to punish him anyway because rules are rules.
Right, that would be totally different.
It's saying the relationship itself, the very foundation of what you call family, is null and void. It doesn't exist.
And the lecture we're analyzing emphasizes how radically new this sociological concept was. Honestly, it's a concept that a lot of the world still hasn't fully grasped today.
Oh, absolutely not.
Up until this point in the narrative, and frankly throughout the vast majority of human history, what has always been the foundation of a tribe, or an Egan, or a family.
Is biology, right?
Yeah, the source points out it has almost exclusively been physical distinctions, shared bloodlines,
Yeah.
shared racial characteristics,
Yeah.
shared geographical origins, or speaking the exact same mother tongue.
You're inextricably bound together by the arbitrary physical realities of your birth.
Precisely. You didn't choose your family, you didn't choose where you were born, but you belong to them because of sheer biology. It's tribalism at its most basic level.
If you're in my tribe, I protect you. If you're outside my tribe, you're a threat.
But the Quran, as presented in this rationalist framework, introduces a completely different standard for human connection. It takes a sword and completely severs those traditional biological ties.
Wow.
The true foundation of a nation or a family is now presented as shared values.
Yeah.
The text refers to as iman,
Iman, okay.
right? A deep, active conviction and a set of permanent principles. If a son fundamentally violates these permanent values, the source argues he is a stranger. He is not all.
The biological connection is just overridden.
Completely overridden by the ideological disconnect. Conversely, someone from a completely different continent, with a different skin color, a different language, who upholds those exact same moral values.
They are closer to you than your own blood.
They are your true family.
It's the birth of the ideological nation. It's the idea that ideas matter more than genetics. But that brings us back to Nu's reaction. Because when he hears this, when the universe essentially tells him his son is a stranger, the text says he immediately backtracks.
Yeah, he realizes his error.
And he apologizes.
He realizes in that terrifying moment that his request was rooted in a lack of knowledge regarding this higher universal law. He was looking at the situation strictly through the lens of human emotion and biological attachment.
Rather than the objective, unflinching divine law.
Exactly. The lecture points out a fascinating duality here. Even prophets have a dual capacity. They possess their innate human nature, and they carry their prophetic, objective duty.
So in his human capacity, his heart was just breaking.
Oh, yeah. He felt the pure, agonizing pain of a father losing a child. But once the divine law was clarified for him, once it was explicitly stated that blood does not and cannot override conduct,
He immediately recognized the flaw in his reasoning.
he asks for Meghfirat and Rahmat.
Let's really spend some time breaking those two specific words down, because the source goes into great detail on them, and they're usually just translated as forgiveness and mercy, which feels a bit,
Passive.
a bit passive.
Very passive. And the author of this lecture rejects that passive translation entirely.
Interesting.
The text defines Meghfirat not just as a simple, emotional, I'm sorry, please don't be mad at me. It defines it as a plea for active protection.
Protection from what?
Well, the root of the word implies covering or shielding. Nu is asking to be shielded from the negative systemic consequences of having acted, even momentarily, out of ignorance of the law.
Ah, so he's saying, I almost compromised the integrity of the system by asking for a biological favor.
Exactly. Protect me from the fallout of that blind spot. And Rahmat, often translated as mercy, is described here much more practically as continued nourishment.
Continued nourishment.
It's a request that, despite this lapse in his understanding, the means for his growth, sustenance, and evolution are not cut off.
I was trying to think of a modern parallel for this to really ground it for you listening. Imagine a Supreme Court judge who is presiding over a massive, high-stakes corporate fraud case.
Okay, good analogy.
And halfway through the trial, they suddenly realize that the key defendant, the person who orchestrated the fraud, is their own nephew.
Wow, yeah.
The biological human instinct might be to steer the trial, to subtly influence the jury, to go easy on sentencing. You want to protect your blood. But the absolute integrity of the legal system demands total impartiality.
The judge has to immediately recuse themselves.
They have to step down from the case. Or think about a CEO who discovers that their own child, who they've groomed to take over the company, is embezzling funds from the workers' pension plan.
That would be devastating.
Firing your own kid, pressing charges against your own flesh and blood is agonizing. It goes against every parental instinct. But it's the ultimate realization that the system's integrity, the rules that govern everyone else in that company fairly, are more important than your biological attachments.
Because if they don't do that,
Right. If the CEO lets the kid get away with it, the entire culture of the company is compromised. The workers lose faith, the system rots from the inside, and the company collapses.
that is exactly the dynamic at play. And the Parwezian framework presented in this text insists that this rational deen, this universal system, cannot abide by exceptions.
Not even one.
If Nuh's son is pulled from the water simply because he happens to be Nuh's son, despite the fact that he was an active participant in the unjust, exploiting class that made the flood a sociological necessity in the first place,
Then the entire concept of universal justice completely collapses.
it would prove that the system is, in fact, rigged.
Right.
It would show that it's rigged for the elite, for the well-connected, for the people with the right pedigree. And the central thesis of the no narrative, according to this source, is to violently demonstrate that the divine system is never, ever rigged.
Which brings up a fascinating, almost alarming question that the source material tackles next. If biological ties don't save you, if being the son of a prophet doesn't give you a lifeline, what actually does?
That's the million-dollar question.
How does this mechanism of justice, this law of requital, as the author calls it, actually function on a day-to-day basis for the rest of us? The lecture goes off on what initially feels like a massive tangent, but it quickly becomes apparent that it's actually the core engine of the entire philosophy.
Yeah, it introduces the idea that human existence is governed by two distinct, non-overlapping sets of laws.
Yes, this is where the intellectual framework of the lecture really opens up and becomes incredibly relevant to modern life.
The author breaks the entire human experience down into two realms, the physical realm and the moral or societal realm.
So let's start with the first set, the physical laws, the laws of nature.
And the source uses a very specific, grounded example here to illustrate this, focusing on agriculture, the farming example.
It's a brilliant illustration because it strips away all the theological jargon.
It really does. The author asks us to imagine a scenario with two farmers. One is named Ram Singh. In the context of the lecture, Ram Singh is presented as a non-Muslim, perhaps someone who doesn't believe in God at all or follows a completely different tradition.
Okay.
The other farmer is Abdullah, who is described as a deeply devout, practicing Muslim. Now, Ram Singh goes out into his field. He follows every single physical law required for successful agriculture.
He tests the soil.
He tests the soil. He plows the land at the precise right depth. He selects high-quality, resilient seeds. He waters the crops at the exact right times of day, and he meticulously protects them from pests and weeds.
He's doing the physical work.
Exactly. Abdullah, on the other hand, completely ignores his field. He doesn't plow. He doesn't sow seeds. He doesn't pull a single weed. Instead, he retreats to the mosque.
Right.
He sits there all day, fasting, praying fervently, reciting scripture, and asking God to miraculously provide him with a bountiful harvest.
And the question the author poses is, when harvest time comes, who gets the crop?
And the answer is obvious. According to the source, the earth will categorically, unequivocally reward Ram Singh.
Because the physical universe, the nitrogen in the soil, the water molecules, the photosynthesis from the sunlight, they do not possess a mechanism to check your religious ID card.
They do not care if you call yourself a believer, an atheist, a saint, or a sinner. The physical laws of nature are entirely objective and ruthlessly neutral. Physical effort yields physical results for absolutely anyone who applies the correct techniques.
That is such a crucial point for you to sit with. If you respect the physics of agriculture, you get the harvest, period. It doesn't matter if you're praying 5 times a day or if you've never stepped foot inside a place of worship in your entire life. The universe does not reward pious laziness.
It does not. The text strongly emphasizes that anyone who masters these physical laws, what the Quran refers to as the laws of the outer universe, will reap the material benefits.
This applies to everything, right? Not just farming.
Oh, it applies to everything. Engineering, computer science, medicine, macroeconomics.
Yeah.
If a completely non-believing, perhaps even personally immoral surgeon performs a complex heart bypass with perfect physical technique, the patient heals just as well as if a saintly believing doctor performed it.
Wow, yeah.
The physical world responds exclusively to competent physical action. If you build a bridge using the correct math and physics, it stands. If you build it with bad math but lots of prayer,
It collapses.
it collapses.
I can imagine that being a very bitter pill to swallow for people who think their religious affiliation should grant them some sort of VIP access to worldly success.
Definitely.
But here is where the text introduces a massive structural tension. Mastering the physical laws, building the bridge, growing the wheat, that is only half the equation.
Right.
If we stop there, which is what a lot of modern civilization does, we are missing the crucial second set of laws, the divine laws, which the author translates deeply as the permanent values.
And what's fascinating here is how the source seamlessly connects the physical mastery to the moral necessity. Because, let's look back at our farmer.
Okay, Ram Singh.
Ram Singh grew a massive, record-breaking crop of wheat by flawlessly mastering physical laws. Congratulations to him. Now what does he actually do with that mountain of wheat? This is exactly where the second set of laws kicks in, the rules that govern the moral, ethical, and economic structure of his society.
And to explain the second half of the equation, the author gives us another incredibly vivid, almost cinematic analogy, this time from a bustling Punjabi market.
Yes. Imagine a powerful merchant in this market who has gathered a massive amount of wheat. Maybe he bought it from Ram Singh, maybe he grew it himself.
Right.
He has successfully and legally utilized the physical laws and the basic mechanics of commerce to acquire this vital resource. But instead of bringing it to the open market to feed the population at a fair price, he hoards it. He locks it all away in his massive, reinforced storehouses.
The text actually quotes a chilling, colloquial Punjabi phrase to describe this mentality, essentially saying, the merchant locks his doors and waits to see how fiercely hungry the people get when the sun goes down.
It's predatory. He is intentionally waiting for the scarcity to become so severe, for the desperation of the poor and the working class to peak so that the prices skyrocket.
Wow.
Now, from a purely physical, unregulated capitalist supply and demand perspective, he is acting rationally.
Right, he's following the rules of the game.
He is following the laws of economics to maximize his personal profit margins. He is winning the game of physical wealth accumulation. But the source forcefully argues, in doing so, he is fundamentally violating the permanent values.
He is violating the principles of human dignity, equitable distribution, and systemic justice. So he is succeeding wildly in the physical realm. His bank account is growing, his power is increasing, while he is completely, utterly failing in the moral realm.
Exactly. The text states that the divine law, the permanent values, dictate that the fruits of human labor and the resources of the earth are fundamentally meant to fulfill the needs of everyone. They are not meant to be consolidated into the hands of a few.
When someone hoards those resources to actively exploit the vulnerable, they are violently clashing with the moral laws of the universe.
It doesn't matter how perfectly aligned they are with the physical laws of wealth accumulation, they are creating a moral friction that the universe will eventually correct.
So let's scale this up. What does this all mean on a macro level? Because one greedy merchant is a problem, but what happens when an entire society, an entire global empire, operates like that merchant?
Yeah. What happens when a culture masters the physical laws, they figure out how to split the atom, they build massive skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, they launch sophisticated rockets into orbit, they invent incredible communication technology, they accumulate unimaginable GDP.
But they completely systematically ignore the permanent values.
Right. What happens when the whole system is built on hoarding and exploitation?
The author is uncompromising about the inevitable result. Such a society, despite its glittering, undeniable physical success, ultimately creates a living hell for itself.
A living hell.
It becomes a society defined by extreme, unsustainable internal friction. You have massive, overflowing physical wealth, but the social fabric is completely shredded. Everyone is at each other's throats.
Yeah, the rich become deeply paranoid, constantly anxious about protecting their hoarded wealth behind gated communities and private security.
And the poor are suffering from systemic exploitation, mental exhaustion, and literal hunger. The entire culture becomes defined by mutual destruction, soaring anxiety rates, epidemic depression, and utter moral bankruptcy.
It looks like a utopia from the outside, but it feels like a nightmare to live in.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here, because if you look at how a lot of people view the world today, they would push back hard on this.
Oh, absolutely.
They would say, look, if I follow physical laws, I get rich. I get comfortable. If I ignore moral laws, well, maybe society rots a bit around the edges, but I'm doing fine.
Right, the I've got mine mentality.
Exactly. Are you really saying, based on this text, that a society can have literal supermarkets overflowing with food, incredibly advanced medical facilities, high-speed internet in every pocket, yet be completely functionally starved of humanity? Because a lot of people look at our material abundance right now and say, hey, we figured it out. We're doing pretty well.
That is exactly the illusion the text is warning against, and the author anticipates that exact pushback. The author notes that many powerful societies look at their material abundance, their technological supremacy, and they declare it the ultimate human achievement.
They say, look at our GDP, look at our military might, look at our conveniences. This is paradise.
But the source insists that if this wealth is acquired, maintained, and protected through exploitation, if the permanent values of equity and dignity are ignored, that society is actually experiencing a form of divine punishment. They're living in a hell right here on Earth.
Wow.
The text describes this state as a society living with a constant gnawing dread of collapse. True peace of mind is entirely absent. The material wealth cannot shield them from the psychological and sociological friction of systemic injustice.
They have half the equation right.
The physical half.
The physical half and the missing moral half ends up poisoning everything they've built.
That perfectly sets up the resolution of the entire news story. Because the flood, when viewed through this rationalist framework, wasn't just arbitrary magical water falling from the sky because God was angry.
No, it was the ultimate inevitable physical consequence of that extreme societal friction.
The elite of news time had clearly mastered whatever physical laws they needed to build their wealth and establish their dominance. But they were hoarders.
They exploited the vulnerable. They mocked the warnings that their system was unsustainable.
And eventually, the sociological pressure cooked until this system exploded. The flood was the universe washing away a chronically unjust, fundamentally unstable elite.
Which brings us to the profound aftermath, moving into Ayat 48. The floodwaters finally recede. The intense violence of the correction is over. The Ark, which in this framework represents the only vehicle built according to both physical laws.
Right. It floated, it was structurally sound.
And permanent values, because it carried those who upheld equity. It lands safely on the mountain. And God issues a very specific command to Nuh as they prepare to disembark.
Descend with peace from us and blessings upon you and upon communities from those with you.
Descend with peace. The Arabic word used there in the text is salam. Now, normally when I hear salam or when anyone familiar with the culture hears it, we just think of a standard greeting.
Like, hello, peace be with you, said in passing on the street.
Right, exactly. But the lecture goes on a massive structural linguistic deep dive here, completely reframing this entire concept from a simple pleasantry to a profound sociological blueprint.
It does, and it's one of the most intellectually satisfying parts of the analysis. The expert analysis in the source elevates salam from a simple interpersonal greeting to a grand structural concept of social physics.
Social physics.
Think about what just happened in the narrative. The previous society, the one that drowned, was entirely defined by friction. Class warfare, exploitation, arrogance, the constant grinding of the poor against the hoarding of the rich.
The flood washed all of that friction away.
Now, as Nuh and his followers disembark from the Ark, they are not just stepping onto dry mud, they are initiating a brand new societal system. Salam here represents a steady state.
A steady state, I love that term, like in physics or thermodynamics, where a system reaches a point of equilibrium. It's stable, it's not burning itself out, and it's not tearing itself apart from internal contradictions.
Exactly. It's a society that has landed safely in a state of evolutionary stability. Because the systemic injustice, the hoarding, the exploitation has been eradicated, the society can finally function smoothly.
It operates without the constant looming threat of internal rebellion, crime waves, or eventual collapse brought on by massive inequality.
The peace isn't just a lack of war, it's the presence of absolute structural justice.
And the text immediately pairs this concept of salam with another crucial word, barakat. The verse says, descend with salam and barakat. Now, I'll be honest, when most people hear barakat or blessings in a religious context, they immediately think of, I don't know, magic money.
Yeah, or spiritual brownie points.
Like, if you say the right prayer before opening your store, your business has barakat, which means the cash register just magically stays full regardless of your business model. What does barakat actually mean here in this strict rationalist framework?
The author aggressively strips away all those mystical, superstitious connotations. Barakat in this context is absolutely not magic. It is strictly defined as the sheer productive capacity of a society that successfully follows both sets of laws simultaneously.
The physical laws of efficiency and the moral laws of equity.
Yes. The source uses a really striking, beautiful visual detail to illustrate this, going back to the agricultural imagery.
Tell me about the fields.
It describes true barakat as crops that are planted so efficiently, utilizing all the best physical techniques, and in an environment so equitable, where the workers are invested and not exploited, that the crops grow incredibly thick.
They grow so dense, so lush, and so healthy that from a distance, the fields look almost black or a very dark, rich green.
That is the physical manifestation of barakat. It means that the resources of the earth are being utilized to their absolute maximum potential, but crucially, they're utilized without any hoarding.
So it's not just that a factory produces 1,000,000 widgets and we call that a blessing. It's that the factory produces 1,000,000 widgets and the manufacturing process doesn't destroy the local environment, and the workers are paid fairly so they can actually afford the widgets and the product benefits the community, and there isn't a single CEO at the top hoarding 90% of the profits while the workers rely on food stamps to survive.
Precisely. Barakat is the resulting staggering abundance when a society aligns physical mastery with ethical distribution. When you remove the friction of greed, when you stop locking the wheat in the storehouse, there is suddenly more than enough for every single human being.
It is the material, tangible manifestation of the permanent values in action.
The text makes the divine directive clear. God is telling Nuh, you have landed safely, the old world is gone. Now your job is to build a society characterized by systemic stability, that's salam, and maximized equitable productivity, that's barakat.
It's such a grounded, fiercely pragmatic vision. It's not about floating on clouds playing harps in the afterlife. It's about doing the hard structural work of building a highly efficient, deeply ethical civilization right here, right now.
But building that requires an engine to keep it running.
It requires the people within the society to understand exactly why they must maintain the system and resist the urge to start hoarding again.
And that brings us to the analysis of Ayat 49, which is perhaps the most intellectually combative part of the lecture.
Oh, this part is fascinating. God tells the prophet Nuh, regarding this entire harrowing narrative, this is the news of the unseen, or Anba al-Ghayb. Now, my initial thought when I hear a phrase like news of the unseen or knowledge of the unseen in a religious text is to immediately think of fortune-telling.
Right, gazing into a crystal ball.
Yeah, it sounds like looking into a crystal ball to see the future or predicting when the world is going to end. It sounds inherently mystical.
And you wouldn't be alone in thinking that. The author readily acknowledges that this is exactly how the phrase is commonly and dangerously misinterpreted by the masses.
But the source counters this mystical interpretation aggressively, using the internal, rational logic of the text itself.
The author actually takes a moment to openly mock the so-called saints and mystics of his own era, the charlatans sitting around claiming they possess some supernatural ability to know what will happen tomorrow.
Right. The lecture specifically calls out people who claim their spiritual powers allow them to predict if a particular commercial train is going to arrive at this station on time, or if someone is going to win a local court case. It's almost comical how petty the examples are.
It is. And the author uses that sheer absurdity to highlight what the Quran is actually doing when it speaks of the unseen. The Ghayb, in this specific context, is absolutely not fortune-telling. It is not magic. It is historical data.
Historical data. Okay, that is a massive conceptual leap. Let's really unpack this. How is the unseen equivalent to historical data?
Because it refers to the deep, slow-moving sociological laws and long-term patterns of history that arrogant elites completely ignore. The elites cannot see these patterns.
They are unseen to them.
Exactly. They are unseen to them until the flood of consequences finally hits them. The average person, and certainly the hoarding, powerful elite, only sees the immediate, tangible present. They see their current bank balance. They see their immediate political power. They see the physical walls of their storehouses.
They are completely, willfully blind to the long-term historical mechanism of cause and effect.
Ah, I see. So when the Quran relays the story of Nuh, it isn't just telling a spooky, dramatic bedtime story about the ancient past to scare people into being good.
It is providing the hard empirical data of exactly why Nuh's methodology succeeded and why the hoarding, arrogant elite were systematically wiped out.
It's essentially a sociological case study. It's saying, here's the data set from a previous civilization. Look at the inputs. Rampant exploitation, massive hoarding, ignoring the warnings of systemic fragility. Now look at the output. Total societal collapse.
If we connect this to the bigger picture the author is painting, the Quran is acting as an engine of reason for human civilization. It is actively presenting the underlying mechanics of societal rise and fall.
The unseen is the inevitable long-term consequence of violating those permanent values we discussed earlier. The elites of news time couldn't see the flood coming, not because it was magically hidden behind a curtain, but because their sheer arrogance and their addiction to greed blinded them to the basic sociological reality that unsustainable inequality always, eventually, leads to ruin.
A system under that much friction will eventually catch fire.
And the text points out a very specific recurring historical pattern that plays out during this clash between the value system and the elite system. It describes how the rich elite almost always react to prophets or reformers.
Yes, the text notes that whenever a prophet or any genuine proponent of truth brings this message of equitable distribution and permanent values, the arrogant elite have a very predictable standard response.
They look at the prophet's followers, who are almost invariably the marginalized, the working class, the lowly people of society who are suffering under the current system, and the elites demand that the prophet kick them out.
They say, "We are men of wealth and status. We will not sit in the same room with these peasants. If you want us to listen to your message, if you want our endorsement, get rid of them."
It's pure class warfare, dictated from the top down. They fundamentally cannot stomach the idea of a system where their hoarded wealth doesn't automatically grant them moral or social superiority. They demand that the class hierarchy be respected even in matters of ultimate truth.
Precisely. And the unseen law, the historical certainty that the text is revealing here, is that if the proponents of truth, the prophet and his followers, maintain sabr.
And we need to pause here because the text redefines sabr.
Right. It is usually translated as passive patience, just quietly suffering.
But the text defines sabr as active steadfastness, unyielding consistency, and resilience in upholding the moral laws regardless of the pressure from the elite.
If they hold the line, if they refuse to compromise the permanent values just to appease the powerful.
Exactly. If they hold the line, the aqiba, the ultimate successful outcome, is absolutely guaranteed for the mutaigan, which translates to those who actively guard and protect these universal laws.
It's a profound statement of sociological cause and effect, not a magical prophecy. It means that an ethical system, if consistently upheld with sabr, will eventually outlast and overcome an exploitative system.
Why? Because the exploitative system inherently destroys itself. The friction of hoarding and injustice eventually tears it apart from the inside, just like news society.
So we have this massive macro-level framework laid out. Master the physical laws, master the moral laws, achieve a steady state of peace, maximize production equitably, and learn from the historical data that exploitation inevitably leads to systemic collapse.
It's a brilliant theory.
But how does a society actually execute this on Tuesday morning? How does it maintain this barakat day in and day out? How do you practically prevent the next generation of elites from backsliding into hoarding?
The source material pivots beautifully here, connecting the macro-societal physics we've been discussing to the micro level of individual daily character. It argues that it all comes down to what the society intakes. It comes down to the deep distinction between halal and haram.
This is where the lecture shifts focus from grand sociological theories to the deeply personal, moral character of a society. And to illustrate how crucial this is, the expert introduces a truly powerful, evocative historical anecdote. It's a story from the era of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni.
Let's walk through the details of this anecdote because it carries so much metaphorical weight for everything we've been discussing. We have a soldier in the Sultan's army, there was a fierce battle, and this soldier is killed in action.
After the dust settles, the military authorities go to the soldier's elderly mother to deliver the tragic news. And they tell her, "We're deeply sorry, but your son was shot in the back while he was running away from the battlefield."
And her reaction is what makes the story so vital. She doesn't just collapse in grief. She doesn't accept the shame. She flat out refuses to believe the official military report. She looks the authorities in the eye and calls them liars.
She tells the high-ranking military brass that they are completely wrong. And her reasoning is what's truly fascinating. She doesn't cite his training. She doesn't demand eyewitness accounts from his platoon.
She says, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, "That is fundamentally impossible. I know my son did not run away because I never fed him a single drop of haram milk."
Haram meaning unlawful or immorally acquired. She is declaring that his physical nourishment from the moment he was born was entirely pure, entirely halal.
The food that built his bones and muscles was acquired ethically. And her logic is that because his intake was morally pure, his internal character must inherently be courageous and steadfast. He physically, fundamentally could not be a coward.
And the dramatic reveal at the end of the anecdote is that her intuition was entirely correct. The Sultan himself investigates the matter, finds out that the authorities lied or were mistaken in the chaos of battle, and discovers that the soldier was actually shot squarely in the chest, fighting bravely on the front lines.
Now, looking at this through the lens of our deep dive, this isn't just a literal story about infant nutrition, is it? We aren't just reading ancient parenting advice about diet.
Not at all. It's a profound, multi-layered metaphor for what a society feeds its citizens. The mother in the story represents the nurturing core, the economic and moral foundation of a community.
The milk represents the resources, the wealth, the ideas, the media, the very lifeblood that sustains the individuals within that society. If a society builds its wealth on haram foundations.
If the milk is tainted through systemic exploitation, wage theft, hoarding, political corruption, or predatory economics,
it is essentially feeding its people moral poison. Even if the physical laws are perfectly followed and the society appears incredibly wealthy and advanced, the internal moral character of the individuals consuming that tainted wealth will inevitably be cowardly, selfish, and corrupt.
they will run from the battlefield of justice. When the going gets tough, when it's time to stand up for equity, they will only look out for themselves because their very foundation is built on taking from others.
Exactly. They won't have the cyber we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But conversely, if a society feeds its people halal sustenance, meaning resources are acquired ethically, wealth is distributed equitably, and the permanent values are honored in every transaction.
Then it breeds citizens of profound courage, integrity, and steadfastness. The overarching character of the society is entirely inextricably dependent on the moral quality of its economic and social intake.
And the lecture brings this concept to a devastating, highly critical conclusion regarding the modern world we live in today. The text forcefully argues that in our current global system, this critical distinction between halal, the morally beneficial, the ethically acquired, and haram, the exploitative, the destructive, the hoarded, has essentially vanished from the public consciousness.
The author makes a stark, deeply unsettling observation about the modern condition. When human beings lose the ability, or worse, lose the desire, to distinguish between what is ethically acquired and what is exploitatively acquired, they suffer a profound devolution. The text literally states that they devolve into mere animal life.
Animal life.
Yeah.
Let's explore that analogy deeply because it hits incredibly hard, especially when you think about consumer culture today.
Think about a cow grazing in a vast field. The cow feels the biological pang of hunger. It sees grass in front of it. It eats the grass.
The cow does not possess the cognitive or moral capacity to stop and ask, wait a minute, who holds the deed to this field? Did another weaker animal need this patch of grass more than I do? Is it ethically sound for me to consume this right now, or am I depriving a future generation?
The cow just acts on raw biological impulse to satisfy its immediate physical need.
It was purely operating on the physical laws. Input equals energy. Desire equals consumption. There is no moral filter.
Yes, and the source argues that when humans begin to act like this, when they blindly consume resources, relentlessly accumulate wealth, and pursue their physical desires without ever pausing to ask deep ethical questions about how those things were acquired or who suffered to produce them.
They are operating precisely at the level of livestock, and the text defines the state of being as enacting kufr.
Kufr. That's a heavy word. In most standard translations, that's simply rendered as disbelief, right? Like not believing in a specific theology.
It is commonly translated that way, but in this rigorous rationalist framework, kufr is defined much more practically and dangerously. It is the active denial of truth. Specifically, it is the denial of the permanent values.
It is living your life as if the moral laws of the universe simply do not exist. It is living exactly like the grazing cow, concerned entirely with maximizing your physical intake and ignoring the systemic consequences of your actions.
Which brings this entire philosophical journey full circle, doesn't it? This concept of animal life in kufr is exactly why Nuh's son, thrashing in the water, could not be saved.
Precisely. It locks the whole narrative together. Nuh's son lived his life entirely without these ethical distinctions. He chose to align himself with an elite class that fed on haram wealth acquired through systemic hoarding, arrogance, and the exploitation of the weak.
He operated purely on the level of animal life, prioritizing his immediate desires, his social status, and his physical attachments over the objective divine law.
Because his internal character was entirely corrupt, because he fundamentally lacked the ideological DNA of the permanent values, his biological DNA, the fact that he was the son of a prophet, could not provide him a life raft.
The mechanism of requital operated flawlessly and objectively. He drowned because he chose the system that was destined to sink.
It is a stunningly cohesive framework. Every single piece of the text locks together to build this argument. So let's pull all these threads together to summarize this deep dive for you. What we've learned from dissecting this source material is that the ancient story of Nu is absolutely not just a mythological bedtime story about a man building a big wooden boat to save a floating zoo.
Not even close. It is a highly sophisticated sociological thesis.
It is a rigorous blueprint for social physics. The flood is not magic, it is the inevitable historical consequence, the unseen data made violently manifest of what happens when a society's physical prowess is entirely decoupled from its moral values.
It is the explosive, systemic collapse of a society that chooses to hoard its wheat while actively ignoring human dignity.
The Ark, then, is not just a feat of ancient engineering. It is the physical vehicle of the permanent values. It represents the only societal system capable of surviving the intense friction of a globally exploitative world.
And that beautiful moment of landing on the mountain, that is the establishment of Salam, a steady-state society finally free of the grinding gears of systemic injustice.
And it is the realization of Barakat, the utilization of the Earth's resources to their absolute maximum equitable potential. It is a vision of a society that purposefully feeds its people halal sustenance, ensuring that their internal character remains strong, courageous, and just.
It is a profoundly sobering, yet ultimately incredibly hopeful vision for humanity. It states unequivocally that societal disaster is not arbitrary and lasting peace is not magical. Both outcomes are the direct, measurable results of the specific laws we choose to follow or ignore.
It puts the entire responsibility for the future squarely on our shoulders. We aren't supposed to be waiting for a mystical rescue operation. We are tasked with doing the hard work of building the Ark through consistent ethical action.
We've seen the flood of Nu today. We've explored exactly what happens when the waters of consequence finally rise. But the lecture doesn't end there.
We are leaving the waters now. The next section of the text, which we will tackle next time, covers Ayat 50 through 53. We are heading out of the floodplains and into the blistering heat of the desert. Enter the ancient people of Ad and their prophet, Hud.
And that transition raises a terrifying, highly relevant question. What happens when an absolute dominant global superpower, a civilization that is so physically advanced it makes Nu's elite look like amateurs, starts to fundamentally believe that its sheer physical strength, its architectural dominance, and its unrivaled military might make it entirely immune to the law of requital?
That is the teaser for where this philosophical journey goes next. We'll be looking closely at what happens when human arrogance reaches its absolute peak and when an empire believes it has outgrown the need for moral laws.
It's going to be intense.
But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Building on everything we've dissected. Look around at the world right now. Look at our modern cities, our global markets, our incredible technology.
We have mastered the physical laws to a degree that would seem like literal magic to our ancestors.
We have built empires of unimaginable, staggering wealth. We possess the physical capacity to grow the crops dark green, as the text so beautifully visualized. But here's the ultimate question you have to ask yourself. Are we utilizing those moral laws to actually build an ark that can sustain us all? Or are we just acting like the merchant in the Punjabi market, blindly hoarding the wheat, acting like grazing animals, completely oblivious while the storm clouds gather on the horizon?